All right, so we're on the focus, and before we start, just wanted to do a little shout out to Bulletproof Enterprise Exotic Limos. So if you're looking for a limo during your graduation or your wedding, or if you want to use it at a photo shoot, just call Bob at 647-531-7919. And today we have director Julia Barnes. She's got a great documentary that she sent me called Sea of Life. And before we get into the film, we're going to discuss a little bit about her background in filmmaking and her concern with environmental issues. So, by all means, tell us a little bit about yourself and and your concerns about the environment, of course.
Sure, yeah. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
No problem.
Yeah, I started making this movie when I was 16, and I had just watched Rob Stewart's documentary called Revolution. And in that movie, I was learning for the first time that the world's coral reefs, rainforests, and fish are predicted to be wiped out by the middle of the century. And, as a kid, I had always been in love with the natural world, but I really had no idea how much jeopardy it was in until I watched Revolution. And watching that film was like a wake-up call, and it just made me realize I've got to do something. I can't just sit back and let these ecosystems and these species that I love be destroyed while I'm watching. Yeah.
And so what was your next step into that?
Yeah, so when I got home, I kind of did a lot of research into Rob and his documentaries, and, I watched every talk and every interview he had done. I was trying to figure out, what he suggested people do after watching his films, what kind of actions we could take.
Right.
And I kept hearing the story about how he made his first documentary, Shark Water, the film all about shark finning and the fact that shark populations had dropped 90% because of shark fin soup. And when he came out with that movie, it really changed the world. I mean, shark conservation groups started popping up, people started fighting for sharks. And so that story made me realize that film is a really powerful way to create change. So it was about a week after watching Revolution and hearing Rob's story and being so inspired by him that I decided film would be the best way that I could change the world too.
Mm-hmm. So were you in school at the time while you're doing it, or was it you actually started filming when you were maybe in the summertime or something like that?
It was pretty close to summer when I started filming. It was about April when I watched Revolution, and it was I jumped into it right away, basically. I did end up skipping a couple weeks of school here and there to go off filming stuff. But yeah, basically I picked up a video camera. I learned how to scuba dive. I signed up for a scuba diving course, and then I went out and I just started filming stuff and interviewing people and trying to piece together this movie. And when I got started, I really had no idea how big of a process it would end up being, making a documentary. I kind of had this crazy idea that I could finish a movie in less than a month, and that totally didn't end up happening. It just kept growing and growing, and I would hear about things like events or people I wanted to interview, and one thing kind of led to another, and it ended up taking 3 years and taking me to 7 different countries and becoming this really big thing. But I'm happy it did, because it was a much more powerful movie than the one I originally set out to make.
Okay, so let's look at the trailer for this film, and then Jeff will pull that up for us.
Cool. The moment you enter the water, you become a sea creature. A whole other world opens up in front of you, where you can do anything and fear nothing. This is the biggest, most important ecosystem on the planet, and it's in trouble.
The basic chemistry of our ocean is changing faster than it has ever changed in the history of the planet.
We're seeing very, very major effects on reef systems already.
100 million sharks a year killed by humans.
There will not be any fish by 2048 if we continue to do what we're doing right now. It is ecological insanity.
We're bringing on a mass extinction in the oceans, and that's something that will change everything on our planet.
It's a crime, not just of the century, but a crime of all time.
And without the oceans, we literally will die.
I set out to make a movie because I believed that if people knew what was going on, they'd do something about it.
Big changes do happen all the time, and they don't happen because governments decide the right things. They happen because people create that change.
This is our task. It's not about, are you going to be a doctor or a lawyer or a secretary? It's about, how are you going to change the world?
When everything you love and everything you depend on is in jeopardy, Action is no longer an option. It is a necessity.
We will be the ones that will be suffering from what the governments are not doing today. It's not future generations, but it's us right now.
So there you have it, folks. The focus today, the documentary Sea of Life. I guess when I wanted to ask you first about Rob Stewart. Of course, he's no longer with us. But let's discuss where he actually taught you to maybe like some filming techniques, or where to go to actually attain your goals, into what part of the oceans that you want to explore and delve into.
Yeah, definitely. Rob was, a huge influence on my life, but definitely also on the film. So he really helped me and mentored me throughout the process. Anytime I had a question, I could email him and he'd get back to me. And he was actually one of the first people who I interviewed, so he kind of gave me a little lesson on how to use a camera, just like really basic stuff, which was super helpful.
Yeah.
And he kind of suggested some of the places that I went to in the film, some really cool people to interview. And he's the one who brought up the idea of going to Cabo Pulmo, which is the marine reserve in Mexico, where fish populations were heavily depleted, but they set up a marine protected area, and within 10 years the biomass increased by over 450%. So that was like a huge, amazing success story, and to be able to showcase that in the film was awesome. So I went there on Rob's advice, and it turned out to be a really cool part of the movie.
Now I see some of the scenes in the film where you're actually holding a camera, and I'm gonna ask, how heavy were those things, or how difficult was it to actually film with that? And of course, you're gonna have to, recharge the camera, of course. And tell us a little bit about that experience of actually filming underwater.
Yeah, filming underwater kind of adds a whole other layer of complexity to the filming process, because you've gotta not only watch out for what you're filming, but you've also gotta take care of yourself. You're scuba diving, you gotta check your numbers and everything like that. But, underwater a camera is essentially weightless. So you can move it around and basically do whatever you want with it. Yeah, it's like, it's weighted so that it just kind of neutrally buoyant. But it does kind of drag you a bit, like if you're moving it around. It's just a little bit of extra thing to carry, but it's not too hard filming underwater. I mean, you got to watch out for certain things, like you really got to watch your O-rings and make sure it doesn't flood. Like the housing, and wreck your camera. That's always a risk. It's a little bit scary the first time you put it underwater, and it's like, is this gonna work? Yeah.
Were they actually warning you about certain fish or certain sharks that were you a little bit frightened at the first time, or were you actually calm when there were sharks in the area?
I was not. I've never had this fear of sharks that a lot of people have, and I think, I never watched Jaws or anything like that.
Yeah,
I wasn't really part of the fear mentality around it.
Yeah.
I think my first media experience of sharks was through Rob Stewart's Shark Water. So I had always had this idea in my head that they're, mostly, for the most part, they're pretty gentle creatures and they're not something to worry about. And that's been my experience with sharks. I mean, typically you're on a dive, you see a shark, it'll look at you and swim in the other direction. They're kind of terrified of humans. Like, we're this freaky foreign object in the ocean. We blow bubbles, we do all this stuff that other sea creatures don't. And even with the bigger species of shark, there's ways of interacting with them safely. You got to do certain things like swim on the same level as them and maintain eye contact, and then they look at you as a fellow predator and not as prey.
Nice.
Yeah.
Not like the movie Jaws, right?
Yeah.
No. Were there a group of fish that you found very interesting while you were? I know you had the cast of fish at the end of your film,
Right.
But was there a certain one that pops up in your mind that these type of fish are really interesting?
Yeah, man, every species, I'm just fascinated by them. And even individuals within species, they all have their own personalities, and people don't tend to think of fish that way, but they're very unique individuals, and each one is different. It's like meeting a different person.
Nice. So let's go into the oceans, our oceans. I believe it was 2014 that you went to.
Yeah.
How did you apply for a media accreditation for that, or how did you end up going to there and you know, setting up your camera and doing what you had to do?
Yeah, I was kind of surprised when I ended up going there that I did get accredited to go in as press. I called them up the day before and was like, hey, I just heard about this conference that's going on.
Yeah.
And can I, you know, come and film this? And they gave me a press pass. And, you know, I ended up in there and there's like FBI agents with their headsets and it's all like big government thing, right? And everybody else is like, you know, serious media. And I'm just there with them. I'm like, okay,
Yeah.
you know, here I am.
But do you think there was the not right number of people, the decision makers that can make an actual difference in that room to make a difference to climate change and of course ocean conservation? Did you feel that the people in the room were those types that could make those types of decisions?
There was some cool stuff that happened there. I mean, people pledged to protect certain areas of the ocean, and lots of people pledged money and stuff like that. And it was, you know, it was cool to see that, you know, just the fact that the government put on this conference means there's some level of awareness and caring about the ocean and wanting to spread that and gather everybody in one place. I think that's, you know, a good starting point. At the same time, I mean, nothing that happened there is sufficient to address this problem on the scale that we're really talking about. I mean, it's not like everybody sat down and then we solved the problems facing the ocean, but you know, it's a start. Yeah.
And so did that take you to COP21 from that point, or was there another person who advised you that you needed to go there?
COP21 was kind of this thing that I had been hearing about for quite a long time beforehand. I went to the People's Climate March in New York, and then there were a couple more marches since then, and everything was kind of trying to build pressure for COP21 and trying to, you know, make sure that the governments came to an agreement, right? Because COP conferences had been going on for such a long time, 20 years. Governments had been meeting and meeting and failing to come to an agreement. So there was a lot of like, is this really going to happen? You know, I don't know. But then, so I hadn't actually planned on going to COP21 because I was kind of disillusioned about the whole thing. But I was interviewing over Skype one of the scientists who was there, a climate scientist called Paul Beckwith. He's from Ottawa. And he was describing to me everything that was happening, and it all sounded quite interesting. So I kind of like dropped everything, and I was like, okay, maybe I should go. And then booked a plane ticket, headed to Paris. It was so last minute, like I didn't even get a press pass, but there was so much going on just outside of the conference, and they had this whole green area that the public could come in and listen to talks and watch what was going on through screens. So yeah, I just went there, and it ended up being a pretty big an important part of the movie, so I'm certainly glad that I did. Yeah. And
talk a little bit about the experience of actually rallying and getting together with the people that you did at COP21, of course.
Yeah, I mean, at COP21, like I said, it was very much not planned. Like, I just jumped on the plane and headed there last minute. So every interview that I actually did there kind of happened by chance, which was really amazing. Like, like none of it was planned. I didn't know these people were going to be there, and then I kind of just ran into certain people whose faces I knew, like Felix Finkbeiner, who was actually in Revolution, and he was a lot older, and I almost didn't recognize him at first. But, you know, he's got the organization Plant for the Planet, and he was running around handing chocolate bars to everyone. He gives one to me. I'm like, oh my gosh, you're Felix Finkbeiner. Like, hey, can we do an interview? And we just set one up on the spot. Nice. Same thing happened with Emily Hunter. Paul Watson, I walked into his talk. I had no idea he would even be giving the talk, you know, but I just, they had a whole bunch of talks going on that day, and I just chose one based on the title. It was something about the oceans. I went in. I sat down and I set up my camera, and then Paul Watson walks in, and I'm like, wow, that's crazy. You know, like I had dreamed to meet him, and I never knew that I would. And yeah, I got to, and then I went up to him after, and I was like, hey, I'm making this documentary. Like, can we do an interview? And we just did one right there. So it was all these kind of crazy coincidental things. But I guess that's what happens when you get this like big environmental conference, kind of brings everyone together who's in this world, and you just collide.
Nice. Could we pull up that Slater talking, Director Slater talking about COP24? So I did watch Youth Unstoppable at Planet in Focus just last year, and Slater actually won for the best film at that.
Cool.
And then we're just gonna watch her discuss what needs to go on in regards to climate change and in regards to ocean conservation, of course.
The climate, being interested in the climate.
No, it's not her.
Because it's
Actually, she's the one in the hat, so. There she is.
And I felt very much alone and was wondering why nothing was happening. I mean, if you really look at it, for 26 years this conversation has been happening, and young people have been stepping up asking, why is nothing being done? Why is this most important thing to affect all of our lives, not the very, crux of all of our decision making? So I think young people are out there and they are standing up and they are demanding that if our governments aren't going to be making the changes that we need to, we're going to step around them. I'm sorry, what was the last part of your question?
It's really what is driving people to do this? I think you've addressed that issue, but how are they taking this action? What does it sound like when others are also stepping up? I mean, this was a very innovative, bold move to sit and say, I'm not going to move, I'm not going to do what I might otherwise do until I can get some attention and people begin to take action. Are you seeing similar types of activity, or how does this manifest itself in other parts of the world?
I mean, within the movement, there are so many different ways that young people are becoming involved and making their voices heard, whether it is one person saying, I'm not going to go to school and because this is so important. You have artists being involved, you have people being involved directly in policy, showing up to UN climate change conferences and being part of that conversation. You have other people who are telling stories, like myself, who are trying to take something that is so strange and is so overwhelming and to make it a conversation that is more about what it means to be human and our connections to each other and to the planet. And so really, I think that's why we're all involved in climate change as well, is that it is such an enormous conversation, and that can be overwhelming, but it can also be very exciting because we have to change everything.
So
Okay, we'll stop right there.
One of the
So she's very similar to what you're doing, and also what Director Natalie Leloucher is actually doing with to the Orchids with Love. How do you feel about leading the movement for the younger generation, or your generation, of course, and using a platform such as film to bring change, or bringing about the conversation about, this is real. This is like climate change is happening, and we need to step forth. And this is a sense of urgency. So how does it feel to actually, be part of that? And how do you view not corporations, but the other people who are not listening?
Yeah, I think it's really cool seeing the way that young people react to this, because it's very different than necessarily the older generations. I mean, there's some great people in the older generations too, don't get me wrong, but every time, like, I've been focusing so much on schools with this movie and going in and giving talks and stuff, like, that's, kids just seem to get it on a level that, a lot of people have kind of roadblocks, and they're kind of cemented into the system already. They've got their job, they're kind of set in their ways, but kids just, they see this problem and they're like, what do we have to do, and why aren't we fixing this? Because we should. Like, it's just very clear to them. And they care so much because, they haven't quite lost that connection to the natural world yet.
So that's, I think that's really good. Do you, is there other platforms do you want to use in order to convey your message, of course, other than film? Yeah, I mean, I don't know yet. I'm thinking about I certainly give talks a lot, and that's one of the ways that I do it. But yeah, film's certainly not the only way. I mean, I'm thinking maybe I should write something, or maybe start doing kind of workshops about activism, because I feel like there's a lot of other areas that we don't really touch on either, like learning about movements of the past and what strategies and tactics have worked, what's been successful, because there certainly have been so many times in history where things have changed, and yet when we're confronted with this massive task that we are right now, people tend to look at it and just kind of be like, oh no, what do we do? But it's like we do have examples of how things have changed in the past, and I think that kind of gets left out of our schooling. I mean, like, I know, like, when I learned history in school, it was very much just call it like the boring side of history. We didn't learn about revolutions. We didn't learn about systemic change and social change and things like that. And I think that's something that's maybe missing from people's understanding. So I'd like to focus on that
in some way.
So I'm not going to date myself, but when I went to York University, I took I do have a Bachelor of Environmental Studies. So not until third year that they actually had a course in regards to advocacy and not rallying, but just environmental advocacy, where you learn about the people who actually went up to to protest about something, and then the ways to go about doing it. And of course, that took third year to actually learn something about it, not in high school, which is kind of it's kind of weird in the sense of the times that we're living today. Do you feel that should be in the curriculum in today's high school curriculum per se?
Definitely. I mean, the first thing we should be learning about, we're living on a world that's being destroyed, and, life on the planet is at stake. So day one, it should be like, this is the problem. What are we going to do about it? Because if we don't solve this, everything else that we're learning is kind of periphery to that, right? It's not going to be relevant if we don't turn things around. We're not going to have a planet to live on. We're not going to have life on the planet. Like, this is really should be taken a lot more seriously in the school system. I mean, I went through most of schooling without even hearing about these problems. It's kind of crazy how much that's just blanked out. Like, we don't talk about it. We don't think about it. It's weird.
Mm-hmm. So the people you met at COP21, to share your experience of the friendships and the relationships you actually built with them afterwards, and tell us a little bit about your your discussions with them, and what you guys talk about, and some of your ambitions and your goals from COP21, of course, from then on.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting conversations was one that I had with Emily Hunter, and the governments had just come to their agreement, and there was this big protest in the street, and the protest had kind of just ended, and I ran into her and did a really impromptu interview. But I felt like it was one of the most honest conversations. We were just talking about the fact that everyone who's looking from the outside was kind of celebrating this COP Paris Agreement as a big success, but both of us were kind of like, this isn't really, what we've been asking. This isn't really what, the solution that we need it to be. This certainly, wasn't going to be enough to save life in the ocean, right? Limiting warming to maybe 2 degrees Celsius if, it's a voluntary agreement, if the people stick with what they said they would, which, doesn't seem like they're on track to right now. But we know coral reefs can't survive warming above 1.5 degrees Celsius. It's really just it seems like people have been begging and begging the governments to do the right thing, and the response, even when they have one, which is quite rare, is so utterly insufficient. And so there just kind of seems to be this idea that we gotta, take things into our own hands a bit more, and either, radically up our demands on the government if we're going to go that route, or somehow bypass that, because it seems to just be again and again and again it's kind of failing.
And your experience, did you film in your film? Did you film the coral reefs in your film, The Sea of Life, and document? And did you actually experience it? And if you did, how did you feel about the bleaching of the actual reefs? And it's basically pretty much the destruction of the city for them. That's their city. This is a fishing city, or this is their habitat.
Yeah.
And how did you feel about that?
So a coral reef is the most biologically diverse ecosystem on the planet. They can be home to thousands of different species, even though they cover less than 1% of the ocean floor. So they're the most biologically diverse, and they're home to about 30% of all species in the ocean at some stage in their life cycle. They're so important. And the rate at which they're being wiped out is just crazy. So I was in Australia about a month before the mass bleaching event happened. And I was interviewing the scientists, and they were all kind of saying, this is coming down the pipes. We know this is happening. And it kind of played out exactly how they predicted. So I was not in Australia when the bleaching happened, but I was emailing scientists and being like, what are you seeing? And can anyone send me footage? So all that, crazy stuff you see in the film of that bleached white coral, that was actually shot by some of the scientists there. And it's pretty heartbreaking, because, it's exactly to be expected, based on the warming that we're seeing and the carbon dioxide that we're seeing in the atmosphere. But it's just wiping out something that is so fundamental to the ocean.
Yeah. I did watch Chasing Coral, and then they were mentioning how there were like websites around the world, like not no, a couple of websites where they all connected, and they actually went for a dive and took pictures of the corals that they were looking at, and then they would share that on the web with other people on their web page, and then they would compare notes, but the conclusion is, the bottom line is that they're actually been bleached. There's actually nothing there, I'm still surprised as to how the governments are not doing anything about it and stuff. But have you looked at those websites too in regards to coral reefs? And
Yeah, I've looked at so many articles and images of them. It's just, yeah, it's pretty amazing. And the fact that it keeps happening, right? Because there was that one mass bleaching event that was in the movie, and then they've been continuing. Like, it didn't stop there. There've been more bleaching events since then, and yeah, it seems to be that's the track we're on right now.
Yeah. Let's pull up the article on which is probably very recent, just a couple weeks ago, on how Canada is like doubling in their climate change. So let's pull that up. And so while Jeff pulls that up, what do you think of that? And let's first look at this one: the Atlantic Canada on a reversible path to significant sea level rise. That's crazy. Let's pull that up a little, push that up a little bit. And yeah, as I guess you can see there that the red would be sea level change from 75 to 100. So can you perhaps shed light as to what's going to happen there to some of the fish that's surrounding that area, or surrounding that their habitat when the sea levels rise like that?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not too much of an expert on like sea level rise and how that affects their habitat. Certainly it would change things. I mean, they're going from, certain types of ecosystems are meant to be at certain depths, right? Certain plants, the light in the ocean kind of diminishes the deeper you get.
Yeah.
So if it gets submerged, then say there's plants growing there, they need to photosynthesize, they won't be exposed to as much sunlight. So that's going to change things for sure. But yeah, it's very different depending on which ecosystem you're looking at, which particular species you're looking at. There's all sorts of ramifications.
There you go. Oh yeah, so shows that the report on climate change shows that Canada's warming as twice as the rate of the rest of the world. Is that just because as a country, we're not paying too much attention, or do you feel that this is maybe fake news, or how do you feel about this situation right here?
Well, it's kind of to be expected, because places that are closer to the poles warm faster than places closer to the equator.
Oh,
That's
I didn't
the
know
science
that.
of how it works. Yeah.
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 So would that mean more wildfires? Of course, sea level rise. What else would be the consequence of that for Canada?
Yeah. Everything you said, like the typical, climate change stuff that you hear about, for sure. Yeah, extreme weather, all that, fires. Yeah. Yeah, it's
Yeah, I can tell it's a very traumatic situation that can happen. So let's go back to your film. Talk about, like, you've brought this film to a few festivals, and what was their reaction, the audience reaction to your film, of course?
Yeah, the reactions have been awesome. People tell me that they cried watching it, which is kind of amazing. Like, I guess I wasn't expecting that, because I edit it and I've seen the footage a billion times.
Yeah.
So like, it doesn't really have an emotional impact on me, but like, to see people respond to it and they get so excited about it too, it's really amazing. And yeah, the response from festivals has been really cool. It's been in 40 festivals. It's been in like more countries than I've ever been to. And it's won like 10 awards at this point.
Nice.
So yeah, it's been pretty awesome to see. It's got a really good response.
Nice. Was there responses different from varying countries, or were there more countries that were actually more active in their participation in their ocean conservation, perhaps, or were there varying results in certain countries, or was there something that that stuck out your head, and like in this country though they said this, or this country they said that?
Yeah, anytime it screens in a country, I typically like get emails from certain people. Like in South Africa, it screened, and then a lot of people were excited about that, and they were emailing me after, and they were like, "Oh, I've got to spread this movie to everybody I know," kind of thing. And it's really cool to see people take that on, and then okay, maybe it's gonna get seen by even more people in that country, and it's yeah, it's weird. Like I've never been to South Africa, but people there are watching my movie, so that's cool.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, people have taken it on in Australia and done screenings. People in the Czech Republic, a lot of people really liked it there.
Nice.
So it's just it's neat to see. Yeah.
So we're gonna pull up Natalie Lusher's trailer to The Orcas Would Love, and hopefully there's no grid here. And I'm pretty sure you know who Natalie is.
I do, yeah.
Our ignorance and the way that we project our own ignorance onto other animals is something that I think we better learn from what we've learned from killer whales. We are astonishingly ignorant. Killer whales are a part of the marine ecosystem, fascinating creatures. We demonize them as pests or fearsome animals.
The whales are my neighbors. I see them as I would any people, another community. They embody family more than humans.
Right now we're in a really significant predicament where we've so destroyed the natural world, our life support system, and the creatures that live there that our survival is threatened this century. To save and conserve the world we depend on for survival, we're going to need a relationship with these animals. We're going to need to see them as interesting. We're not going to protect what we don't love or don't understand.
I'm absolutely concerned for the whales and the way in which the oceans are changing, and I fear for their future. The warming of the oceans, for example, is going to drastically affect the way the orcas food supply.
Garbage like a cruise line ship dumps?
Yeah, I've heard about that.
Very great.
That's crazy.
Problems whether or not they
be there.
can deal with them in the short term is a big question.
And they're swimming in an ocean now with hot particles, and so I worry for them. I worry when I see a newborn child. I look at that child and go, I don't feel good about what you're going to face.
Well, I think the message of environmentalism is that the biosphere, the zone of air, water, and land where all life exists, doesn't have boundaries in it. You know, even the air, the land, and the oceans, they're all connected. One thing we all need as children is to understand that we're intimately connected. We're a biological creature ourselves, and we depend on the rest of nature for our survival.
Okay, so the reason why I brought this film up, well, if I didn't watch this film, then I wouldn't have you here, of course. So the reason why I brought up director Natalie Lusher's film, when I watched it at Hot Dogs, and it amazes me because I know for a fact that we all should be doing it. When she actually went out to BC, and then she lived there, she lived in the areas where she would watch the whales, and she lived there for a month without, just a little hut with nothing, nothing from in an urban environment. And then she would be living with the whales and, talking to them, which is, I think, the only way to understand our world and the environment, and in order to save animals such as whales or to save our ocean, is to actually live with them and is to actually be with our environment, but we're actually not doing that. And what are your thoughts on that, and what are your thoughts of being more, not being more, but having that relationship with our environment, whether it be like a landscape or whether it's animals such as whales?
Yeah, I think it's so important to have that connection, to have that on a personal level, because it's a really weird culture that we have right now, right? Where you kind of wake up in the morning and you go from screen to screen to screen, and we tend to interact with computers more often than we interact with the real world. We're meant to interact with the real world, and we love that, and we're born with a fascination of that for a reason. That's what we evolved for. And yeah, I mean, I think everybody kind of has this innate like fascination with nature and love of nature. And when you're a kid, you just want to go out and chase bugs and frogs and stuff, you know, like that's awesome. And you kind of, in this culture, we're taught to lose that as we grow up, but we really need to maintain that. We need to have that love and that connection to the natural world, because that's what's going to make us want to fight for it. You know, I want to care about coral reefs and sharks and fish and all that stuff because I'm in love with that stuff. You know, that's where my allegiance lies.
Do you know other filmmakers who have been inspired by Rob Stewart's legacy? And I know Natalie's one, and of course you are one. Do you know any other filmmakers who have other projects going on because of Rob Stewart?
Yeah, lots of people have been inspired. A woman named Melanie, she lives in Quebec, I believe, and she's about to be starting a documentary. She's kind of in the initial research stages of that right now, but I think it's going to turn out to be really cool.
Nice.
Dream Reef Cinema, I believe, is a company that they're doing a documentary all about sharks, and they were very much inspired by Rob as well. There's so many people out there who were inspired by him, like thousands of people, you know, watch his movies, and yeah, I mean, they impact you in such an amazing way. I feel like Rob, you know, whether you knew him in person or whether you saw him on the screen, he just kind of gives you this idea that you can do something, that you can change the world. You know, he kind of instills that in you. He's got such an energizing kind of vibe, and yeah, he just lifts you up.
So tell us, what are some of the solutions that you think that would, it's not going to change overnight, of course, we all know that, but what are some of the solutions from your perspective, and what should we do in order to get to the part where we can try to solve this problem about climate change and stuff?
Yeah, I mean, in the big sense, it's really simple, right? We got to stop the destruction. We got to stop polluting the natural world and stripping life out of the ocean and cutting down the forests and all that stuff. And we have to let life come back to this planet, because life sequesters carbon in a really amazing way. You know, we all know plants pull carbon out of the atmosphere when they grow. So if we brought back the prairies, if we brought back the forests, you know, so much of these ecosystems have just been wiped out. And if they came back, we could pull so much carbon out of the atmosphere. And fish actually play a huge role in the carbon cycle, which a lot of people don't realize. But there's so many processes that involve, you know, fish coming up from the depths of the ocean and feeding at the surface and then going back down and excreting their waste where it gets locked away and sequestered, you know, in the depths of the ocean. So, you know, 90% of the fish have been wiped out at this point. If we let that life come back, we could sequester so much carbon. And, you know, doing all these things, we could absolutely reverse a lot of the big challenges that we're facing.
So you say 90%?
Yeah.
So there's only 10% left. And have you studied how long of a span have we actually done that from? How do we reduce that from like 100 to 10?
I believe it's measuring from 1870, I think that's the number, to 2005, I believe, was the time span, where it just, but yeah, it certainly accelerated with the rise of industrial fishing, right? And within, I believe it was a 50-year time span, we lost about 90% of the large fish in the ocean.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a big one. That's a big one. So what are your future plans in regards to, you know, bringing about change and bringing about, you know, continuing Rob Stewart's legacy, of course?
I've been working on a new documentary for the past about 3 years, which is all about solutions to environmental problems and how we're going to turn things around. It's also going to reveal a pretty big scandal in the environmental movement and the fact that a lot of things that are being pushed as solutions are actually highly destructive for the environment. So there's some crazy stuff going on, and it's going to expose all that, and it's going to be very interesting. But it calls for more radical activism and for bringing back nature to this planet. Yeah.
Now, you can do a plug, and is there somewhere we can find Sea of Life? Tell us a little bit about that, or we can find some of your work.
Yeah, absolutely. So Sea of Life you can find at seaoflifemovie.com. That's the website, so you can watch it. You can either get it on Vimeo on demand, or you can order the DVD and watch the movie. We're on Facebook as Sea of Life. We're on Instagram as @SeaOfLifeMovie, so look us up anywhere.
Okay. Yeah. So thank you so much for being here and telling us about Sea of Life, and of course your concern for the environment. And thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me.